As a way to find our way into this, I tried to figure out a few threads through the density of information that there is, as if we were trying to maybe create a collective urban housing project. So that is the structure. And starting off, this is actually my work going back through the years. Sorry about that.
Could you talk into the microphone, please?
Sure, sorry. No, the microphone doesn't come with me. That's for the recording. Now, and they precurse some of the issues that we have. There's a group of elderly single people got together and did this project because they were aging and they didn't want to go into a home, right? You'll see when that was, but this is a current need. We have mixed tenure, affordable, sustainable urban housing. Again, research-based project that integrates the university work and practice. And Delhi Village co-housing, now completely occupied. That's a more rural co-housing project. Sorry, I'll try and chain myself here. This is a paper presented 2017 into 2017. Everybody knows Earthsong. Not everybody knows this project, which to me it was actually the predecessor for Earthsong, and it's way more important in a number of ways, or at least as important. So there is now a paper on that that documents its history and its significance. That is available publicly. And I quote from that, one of the reasons that it's significant is because there's a direct connection back to the earliest of the Danish co-housing, which whenever you start reading about co-housing, you soon find that there's a couple of important precedents, and this is one of them, Saddle-Darman, and Michael was there around the time, just after it was established, researching the balance between the individual and the community and how that was managed. And, you know, some simple things, common parking, common facilities, and a couple of courtyards, all pretty straightforward stuff. Okay, so what is collective urban housing? And I use that term as opposed to co-housing because I find co-housing very, as a term, I guess something that people are quite proprietorial over. They think they know how it works, they have their own version of it. But actually, from what I see, it's an incredibly diverse field, and there is a lot of different ways that we might live together, and I note them up there. You know, co-living is an emerging one, which essentially is hostels for adults and, you know, rentable, fully furnished, and coming about primarily for economic reasons, but also for social reasons. So the book that Philippa showed you, I'm quoting from on the right here, and this is Michael Lefrand, and it's pretty important. Importantly, he sees the Bragruppen in Germany and Berlin, particularly through Scandinavia as well, and in Austria. Partly these are building on traditions of co-ops that go back a number of years. So they have an understanding of community living that is different to what you get in more Western places. But still, from that, there is an increasing understanding that this becomes a way to work alongside a free market approach to provide different modelled for both housing delivery and the type of housing that's there. So our research, you'll see, has identified 4 major pathways to realise collective urban housing, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So this comes from one of last year's students, Jen, and what is collective or co-housing, and what are the things that people have in common? It actually typically works for a number of demographics, including single people, which she doesn't have there, but what is in common? And there's some characteristics here, and this is out of, she is quoting actually the key co-housing text by McCormick and, sorry, it fails me, there it is, and Durrett. But participatory planning and development designed to facilitate community, common amenities, shared management, non-hierarchical structures and separate income sources. That's as Jen's described it, but it might not all be ownership. It might also be rental. Okay, now these are a couple of good precedents of kind of lower medium density that come out of Danny Bloxham's thesis. They're well known, people will know them, but the key about them is in this one, the parking is under, and in this one, the parking is around. And there's somehow a public realm that's created that's not all about private and street. There's this in-between social realm. Okay, so individualism and the collective. What is in common? What do we share? That's a key question and a pretty threatening thing for people who like their own little space. So what brings people together? And what we can say is there's a huge diversity in co-housing projects. You know, this is from Sprayfeld, but you'll find even within Sprayfeld, which I will show you a bit more of soon, that they're all laid out quite differently. There's actually several communities within the community, from some that are kind of like shared flats really, to others that are more individual apartments. So will we share meals? How often? What other social activity? We're actually time poor. You know, the idea of sharing meals might not be so appealing. You think, maybe you think back to the dorm days at university. But when you think about the production of a meal every night, and the thought of maybe only doing that once every 3 weeks and then being able to put a bit more effort into it and share it with some others, it's not quite so bad, right? So what are the things in common? Quite often there'll be philosophical things, the Quakers, that brought them together. It might just be affordability, right? It could be a concern about the environment. There's a great diversity of co-housing projects, from projects for older people, some major projects that I'll show you come about as a result of people wanting to live differently, wanting help with parenting, for instance, is a common one. The big issue for any international community is how do you manage the balance between the individual and community life? And this is from a man who's lived it all his life. Okay, I've got some key precedents. Sargfabrik in Vienna is one, and Miss Sargfabrik, which is the sister project that works in a complementary way with it, are very important precedents. There is an incredible amount of community engagement that goes on in this place, with everything from their own markets and restaurant that serve the wider community, early childhood centres. They've got a public baths within their facility. These two Bragruppen are both from 2010, both of them in kind of more socially what would I say, a lower socio-economic environment that's gentrifying. And the thought is that there is a role that a lot of these play to gentrify. And sometimes there's a critique of co-housing as actually being exclusive. So they're very different. The one that you see here, actually there's only 7 apartments. It was architect generated, the architect's office is here, right? And it's a really wonderful, beautiful building, but they feel quite keenly the critique that of their surrounding community, that somehow this change that they're part of is changing the community. Spreefeld, which is on the River Spree in Berlin. You'll see these 3 apartments, and with a lot of common space. The entire ground floor is given over to common space, whether it be co-working. They have a public gallery there. They have their own workshop that they did their own fit-outs for the apartments from, and they have common kitchens and public facilities for the use of them. They even have a little boathouse for parties on the river. But very diverse, and it's worth noting that these come about as a result of support of a benign local authority. So through proposals and support, particularly in this case, the creation of right-of-ways through helped this. So you'll see the number of people that sit for dinner around this quite wonderful table. Okay, communication management, process management, facilitation. How do we decide who is in control? All of us, none of us, some of us, who leads? This is the kind of dynamic that a community group, when they're forming and setting through, struggles with and works out. And it does change over time as well. So do you meet monthly, weekly? Is there a committee structure? Is there a body corporate? In New Zealand, mainly yes, of course. But how does that work? Is it working as an executive, right? You'll find that most of the precedents that we look at don't work that way. They have a more distributed leadership and a trickle-down kind of committee structure where everyone is involved rather than some kind of semi-professionally involved on our behalf. So as these are setting up, what is the leadership structure? Is there one? You know, are we working through consensus? Are we using facilitation? There is a whole group of semi-professional people emerging, and in New Zealand too, whose role is to facilitate groups. And typically the Bragruppen that we saw all have people semi-professionally involved doing the communication management particularly the larger ones. So how big are we? I skipped over that earlier, but at a certain point, communication becomes hard when you've got too many. And we can communicate a lot easier today with things like Lumio and Slack and so forth, but who's on what lists and what are the kind of hierarchies that are going through a project? Somehow, also, what are the motivations? Everyone's an expert, it seems to me. I come across a lot of experts in co-housing in New Zealand, a tremendous amount of them. And that expertise is all valuable in a way, it really is, but it's often quite unique to a project or a way of working. How are disagreements resolved within groups? And what about ongoing stuff? Yeah, so there's a great quote from Michael Lefrond there that I'm sure you've read. So, again, this is Sprayfeld partway through. So, and the quotes on the left are all, or the top two anyway, are from Michael Payne. Now, importantly, he sees the number of houses and people in the community as being the maximum. There's 17 houses and around 35 people. He sees that as the maximum for self-management. They self-manage by consensus. And he said, it's just a practical thing. When you get that many people together, really it takes a lot of organisation even to manage that, right? They meet weekly. So after that size, you become more semi-professional. You have to have somebody employed. So that's a key thing, it seems to me, and I'll show you a little bit of research in a minute that quantifies what people actually want. Right, so I mentioned the dispersed communication. Okay, costs, financing, daily obligations. Something that co-housing people talk about is the cohousing tax, right? The cohousing tax is the time it takes to work things out. It's the time that you contribute to other things in the community, whether it might be a community garden, it might be cleaning the kitchen. So somehow there is an obligation that also comes, and people are often not quite so fussed in that side of it. Down on the left, in the image there, that actually is the market at Sarg Fabrique. And on the right is Delhi Village, the project I was involved in. They're re-roofing the woolshed that also got moved and converted into the community facilities. And they're milling logs at the top there. So this idea of distributed responsibility that equally shares leadership and management occurs for some, but not for others. The other thing to draw your attention to, and this came from Franz, the architect at Southcombe Fabric, he said in their community, really they've got 20% really engaged, 60% somewhat engaged, and 20% they could be living anywhere. They're not really engaged at all. And he seemed to think that that was how it had always been. Okay, the design part itself and ideas of co-design and participatory design in many ways go hand in hand with the idea of co-housing, but it's not always that way. You'll see on the right, again from Sprayfeld, there was actually a palette of elements that residents could work with, and they could shift and change certain things, but not a heck of a lot. In fact, there were 3 architects involved, one in each building, and again using those same basic structures and elements. Okay, so how do you have that input, right? One of the things that Michael did, and it was really smart, at the settlement he worked out an agreement on an agreed material palette and appearance of the buildings, right? Now he then designed 17 completely individual houses that don't look that way. There's a unity when you come there, so somehow that individuality and the unity is addressed. And it's the same with Big Yard, another very famous project. And this, again, was really architect driven, and you'll find there's a little bit of choice. You've got how you do your bay window, right? And other than that, your choice is limited to what happens inside your rather beautiful apartment. And it is great space, actually. When you visit that space, you find that there's a lot of people using it. Okay, this is a little bit of research I was referring to. What do actually people want? Now, this comes from a co-living survey rather than a co-housing survey, but it's a pretty good sample, 7,000 people from 150 different countries. And from this online survey, there's some kind of remarkable things that come out of it. People actually do want to live together. Loneliness is a bit of an epidemic in our individualistic society, and a lot of people do want social exchange. That's the reason they want to do it, right? So the main reason they say is to socialise with others. And you'll see some really interesting things through here, and one of them was size. You'll see here that they want something from 4 to 10, I think, from memory. I can't quite see where it is because right at the top, there you go, 4 to 10 people, right? So that gives you a sense of what they want. They want pets. They prefer to know who they're living with. Yep, 5 minutes. Thank you, Philippa. Okay, I'm going to take you quickly through some master's research from this last year, and this research is based on densifying the suburb and the idea of the common space, the common space between buildings. So there's a pattern here where every third house has a shared space between. So sharing is through landscape. This one, based in Johnsonville, works very much on the idea of a mixed tenure social housing. So very good, strong research into the social implications of living together, and particularly in this kind of size. And you'll see it's rather a large project, which is separated into 4 quarters. The big house here is the idea of transitional housing for very low income people, and again this mixed tenure, mixing people with a little bit more I guess a social capital. And this one from Genevieve Walsh, which is based at the base of Mount Vic, looks to translate Sag fabrique to a New Zealand context and to identify what other culturally specific components of housing. Really a first-class set of design here that figures out that Kiwis want to be able to control their environments. That's one of the things they like, control and adapt. And it's also something that we saw in Sag Fabrique, where they had what they called the divorce model, so that houses could be split and replicated. So key moments for establishing a co-housing project we see here. and I'll just shift on to my mega spreadsheet. But you'll see, actually, we've split them into four different really threads, and really it plays out as two: commercially and more partnership models. Most of the major co-housing projects that you see come about through agency support in some ways. Quite often, in Germany in particular, there will be a public competition calling for co-housing proposals. So they identify the social capital and the social gains for the community. And so there is a tender, and increasingly happening in the UK as well. And so commercially led, particularly in the UK, they've realised there's a demand. And so you often find landowners seeking co-housing tenants. Community takes a bit longer. 7 years is the average. And somewhere along the line, these often will come together, so an agency might seek community input. So there's a lot of steps, a lot of key milestones. So regarding that, there are significant benefits, but there's also opportunities. So this is, I guess, a plea to support more research. We're researchers, and the research, I think, needs to make increasingly open source resources available to help co-housing groups. You'll find the franchise model, which I didn't really talk about, haven't had the time to, but the Commons in Melbourne is a great example, and it has been franchised, and there are a number of them underway in Melbourne and here. And there's a huge advantage with them. You give away some things, a bit like the Big Yard project. You might not have as much choice or as much input, but you get the weight of a bigger company, you get the well worked through procedures, so big saving in time and certainty, and that's a helpful thing. So Cohousing New Zealand have a good website. There are a number of groups trying to get going in Wellington. I think one of the things that we should do is interface with Tim Gummer and that website. They do a great job, and so that you provide a way that people can find you as well as you find them. I guess to conclude, I would say that the very first co-housing in Denmark came about through advocacy, really, from people who saw the advantages in a different way of living. And there was an essay, children should have 100 parents, literally. And from that, they had overwhelming demand. There was 200 couples that wanted to be part of that first project. And it took them a long time to get it going. And there was other open press articles that did the same. So I see advantage in making resources that are open sourced and readily available to help groups form and efficiently figure out what works and what doesn't. Things like the financing and the financing models are big stumbling blocks. There's land, of course, as well. There's the social demographics of the group and what it is that they have in common, and so on, as noted there. I think that's pretty much it, yeah.